Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that literally touches almost every single one of us every single day, whether we realize it or not. I'm talking about management. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Management sounds like a dry corporate buzzword, right? But it's actually not. Management is this invisible, super dynamic force that organizes human effort. It's basically the art and science of getting things done through and with other people to achieve a shared goal. I mean, it's the exact same force that built the pyramids, and it's what put a rover on Mars. So today, we're going to trace the fascinating DNA of how this whole concept has evolved over time.
Okay, let's dive into this. We'll be covering anatomy of a manager, the manager's toolkit, the machine era, the human element, the systems approach, and finally, the modern landscape.
Section 1. Anatomy of a Manager. Decoding the DNA.
So this brings us to one of the absolute oldest debates in the business world. Is management an art or is it a science? It's a really great question, and it completely challenges us to think critically about how organizations are actually run.
Well, on one hand, we have management as a systematic science, right? This is all about using observation, complex mathematical models, and rigorous testing to find the absolute optimal way to run a business. But then on the other hand, you have management as a creative art. This side relies heavily on personal skill, gut intuition, and practical on-the-ground knowledge. So what's the truth? Modern management is actually a blend of both. A manager's creativity is just massively magnified when they use scientific methods to back up that artistic intuition.
And this whole balancing act, it's completely central to Henry Mintzberg's famous theory. Mintzberg actually went out and studied executives, and he realized pretty quickly that a manager's daily life isn't just, sitting behind a big mahogany desk pointing fingers. It's a holistic pie made up of three main slices. First, you have interpersonal roles, so being a figurehead and a leader. Then you've got informational roles, monitoring all the data and acting as a spokesperson. And finally, decisional roles, allocating resources, negotiating, and handling those sudden out-of-nowhere disturbances. It's just a constant balancing act.
Section 2. The Manager's Toolkit. Skills and Functions.
Management legend Peter Drucker famously noted, "The efficient manager does things right, and the effective manager does the right things." This distinction is absolutely vital. Efficiency is basically an input-output concept. It's all about minimizing costs, reducing waste, using your resources wisely. But effectiveness, that's about choosing the right goals in the very first place. Think about it. You could be perfectly efficient at manufacturing a product that literally nobody wants to buy. And obviously, that makes you highly ineffective. You absolutely need both.
So, to actually achieve that sweet spot, managers rely on Henri Fayol's foundational steps. Step 1 is planning, forecasting the future and setting your goals. Step 2 is organizing, grouping up tasks and assigning resources. Step 3 is staffing, finding the exact right people for the job. Step 4 is leading, influencing and motivating those people. And finally, Step 5 is controlling, which is just measuring your actual performance against your plans and making quick corrections if you start veering off track.
Now, when you map these specific skills across the actual hierarchy of a company, this totally fascinating inverse relationship appears. At the lower levels, your frontline supervisors rely heavily on hands-on, technical skills. But as you move up into top management, the need for technical skills shrinks, and conceptual skills, seeing the big picture and understanding complex relationships, those become absolutely vital. But check this out. Human skills are universally required no matter where you happen to sit on the corporate ladder.
Section 3. The Machine Era. Efficiency above all.
Historically speaking, if we look before the 1900s, back in the pre-scientific era, pioneers like Robert Owen started realizing that treating workers like actual human beings, like investing in shorter hours and decent housing, actually paid off. But then, as factories literally exploded in size in the early 1900s, we entered the scientific and administrative era. This became hyper-focused on efficiency and rigid structure. Eventually, the pendulum swung back in the 1930s with human relations before we finally arrived at the super-complex systems era of the 1960s.
Let's look closer at that intense early 1900s scientific era, because two major schools of thought emerged here. First, Frederick Taylor gave us scientific management. He essentially treated humans like literal machine parts. He timed workers with stopwatches to find the absolute most efficient way to perform a single task, completely replacing the old rule of thumb with hard science and paying people per piece they produced. Meanwhile, Max Weber introduced bureaucracy. Now, I know today bureaucracy sounds like a bad word, right? But Weber meant it as a rational, highly structured system based on strict rules, clear hierarchies, and merit-based promotion. He wanted it entirely stripped of personal feelings or favoritism.
And honestly, this complete obsession with efficiency birthed some truly quirky concepts. Take the Thribligs, for example. Frank and Lillian Gilbreth were pioneers of time and motion studies. They literally filmed factory workers frame by frame to classify every single hand motion required to complete a job. They were trying to eliminate even a tiny fraction of a second of wasted movement. And they called these classifications Thribligs, which, get this, is just their last name, Gilbreth, spelled backwards. Well, mostly backwards anyway. But it really was an early precursor to the incredibly precise warehouse logistics we see everywhere today.
Section 4. The Human Element, the Psychology of Work.
So the pivot away from all that machine-like efficiency is largely thanks to Elton Mayo and the famous Hawthorne experiments at the Western Electric Company. Mayo was originally brought in just to see if better lighting made workers more productive. They turned the lights up, and sure enough, productivity went up. But then, mysteriously, they turned the lights down, and productivity still went up. What Mayo discovered here is what we now call the Hawthorne effect. The workers weren't reacting to the physical light at all. They were reacting to the fact that management was finally paying attention to them. They felt seen, they felt valued, and they developed real group pride.
In this discovery, it triggered a massive paradigm shift. The whole era of the pure, rational man, the idea that a worker is just this solitary machine who only cares about collecting a paycheck, that was totally over. Management had to wake up and recognize the social man. They had to acknowledge that workers crave dignity and are super heavily influenced by the informal social bonds and group pressures they form on the factory floor or in the office.
Section 5. The Systems Approach, the Organization as a Living Organism.
Now, moving forward, a massive concept from the post-war era, derived from Daniel Katz and Robert Kahn's open systems theory, is synergy. It's the idea that an organization isn't just a bunch of isolated, closed-off departments. No, it is a living, breathing, open system. It imports raw materials from the outside environment, it transforms them, and it exports the finished product. And when those internal subsystems, like marketing, finance, and production, when they actually cooperate, the whole becomes significantly greater than the sum of its parts.
But perhaps the absolute most practical takeaway from this era is contingency theory. If previous eras were completely obsessed with finding the one best way to manage, contingency theory took that and threw it right out the window. Its core mantra is basically just, it all depends. Management is entirely situational. The perfect organizational structure or leadership style changes completely based on the unique external environment, the technology being used, and the specific human beings involved. You have to match your approach to your specific situation.
Section 6. The Modern Landscape, Managing in the 21st Century.
Today's managers are dealing with forces that Frederick Taylor couldn't have even imagined in his wildest dreams. We have globalization, which means managers have to think across borders. We have total quality management, which focuses relentlessly on customer satisfaction, not just churning out cheap products. There is a massive, absolutely crucial push for environmentalism and corporate sustainability. We have growing workplace diversity, which requires deeply inclusive cultures. And we're seeing an ethical reawakening, where managers are finally being held accountable not just for pure profit, but for how their decisions impact society at large. So, to navigate all of this crazy complexity, leaders rely on modern frameworks like the McKinsey 7S model. Being an effective manager is no longer just about your strategy and your structure. You have to delicately balance those hard elements with the soft elements, like your staff, your organizational style, the skills of your team, and those crucial shared values that act as your company's compass. If even one of these 7S's is out of alignment, the whole system is going to struggle.
We've definitely journeyed a long way from treating workers like literal machine parts to truly valuing them as complex social humans. But here's something to chew on. Today, as artificial intelligence and software completely automate the science of efficiency and data processing, will the future of management rely almost entirely on the art of human empathy, interpersonal connection, and ethical judgment? It's a deeply fascinating question, and honestly, it's one every single modern leader is going to have to answer. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.